Hi, welcome to the NCAPA APIs in Education in the First 100 Days webinar. Thank you for joining us today. I am Rita Pin-Ahrens, Director of Education Policy at CRAC, and I'm going to introduce you to our other speakers today.
Hi everyone, my name is Kim Hall and I'm the Civil Rights Fellow at OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates.
Hi everyone, this is Monica Tamrath, also co-chair of the committee, and I'm first vice president of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance.
Hi everyone, this is Suvan Lee. I'm a education policy associate at CRAC, the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center.
And we're going to let Suvan go over some logistics of the webinar controls.
Yeah, so again, thanks everyone for joining. Currently, everyone is muted, and on your computer on the webinar, there should be a control panel. You should see an option for a chat. If you have a question or if you want to communicate with us, just click on that, and there will be a drop-down menu, and it will allow you to communicate with us.
Okay, great. So let me tell you a little bit about NCAPA, the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. We're a coalition of national API organizations striving for equity and justice by organizing our diverse strengths to influence policy and shape public narratives. And we're about 34 national API organizations across the country. So we have several committees that make up NCAPA. We have a Civil and Human Rights Committee, an Education Committee, Health, Housing and Economic Justice, and Immigration. And within the NCAPA Education Committee are the following organizations: OCA Advocates, APALA, CRAC, API-ASF, JCL, CNHA, and LANA. So I'm going to turn it over to Monica Tamrath.
Hi everyone. So this section of our webinar, I'm going to go over a summary of different executive actions that the new administration has taken since coming into office. Since taking office, the president has signed 78 executive actions so far. While many will say that most of these orders, actions, and memos are theatrical, it's still going on at an unprecedented pace and also gives us a good idea of what his priorities are. Just to review, there are three main kinds of executive action that an administration could take. The first is executive orders, which are assigned numbers and published in the Federal Register. The second type is presidential memorandum. Unlike executive orders, they don't have to be published or numbered. And then the third are proclamations, which, like President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, have carried a lot of weight, but are mostly ceremonial. So just kind of looking at the different different pace of executive orders that other presidents have taken. So for example, our first president, George Washington, actually signed a total of 8 executive orders during his entire time in office. It was kind of a big point. He didn't want to exert too much power in the executive branch. President Franklin D. Roosevelt actually signed over 3,700 executive orders while he was in office. He was a very active executive branch. And just looking at modern presidents, so to compare President Trump with, for example, our previous president, President Obama. President Obama, in his 2 terms, signed a total of 277 executive orders, which is on par with modern presidents. And just as comparison, in the first 100 days, President Trump has signed 32 executive orders already. So some of his orders that have really gotten a lot of news coverage has been around immigration. So, for example, just a few days after he was sworn into office, the new president signed an executive order around border security and immigration enforcement. For example, one thing that this executive order created was an office to aid crime victims. It also escalated deportations, and there was also a wave of raids in different cities. I'm sure you have heard some of that. More specifically, there have also been executive orders around what folks are calling the Muslim ban, which temporarily barred people from majority Muslim countries from entering the country. Several judges in several states have declared this order unconstitutional, and but the administration is still standing behind it. So I say all this to say that a lot of the executive actions that the new president has given so far aren't necessarily targeted towards education or towards students, but really have an impact to students in the classroom, especially immigrant students or Muslim students or students who appear to be immigrant or Muslim. So, and there have been actually a couple of executive actions that are specific to education. So the first one is around enforcing statutory prohibitions on federal control of education, which was issued on April 26th. This actually, the specific executive order actually talks about how the department, he actually charges the new Secretary of Education to review the interpretation of a wide variety of Department of Education documents, ranging from regulations to Dear Colleague letters to superintendents, to policy statements, to manuals, to memorandums, to pamphlets, bulletins, advisories, technical assistance, grants, applications for waivers. So it really is a very wide swath of documents that he is asking the new Secretary of Education to look over. I think immediately it really alters the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which just passed last year, which we have had different webinars to discuss different parts of it. But we also want to emphasize that it goes beyond that, right? It's not just about ESSA, but it also, since it's such a wide range of documents to review, it actually could and will probably impact the way the department has worked with several populations that we care deeply about, like English language learners or LGBTQ students, or limited English proficient parents even. And, you know, even when it's also being asked to look at grants of applications, this could also impact API serving institutions, our data disaggregation grant that we had last year. And so this has far-reaching possibilities of impact. Even outside of executive orders, the president also has had some non-kind of official executive action. So, for example, right at the beginning of his administration, he set out a proclamation calling January 22nd to the 28th National School Choice Week, which really is not a surprise given his stances on public education and his current secretary's stances on public education. So, you know, there have been some very official actions and then as well as very ceremonial actions that have taken place. But I think all of this is to really say that, you know, And my colleague is going to go over the budget blueprint and just kind of his theory. Overall theory is really looking at how to increase defense spending by cutting non-discretionary spending like education, and then also decreasing federal regulations in general. Looking at getting rid of outdated regulations, but also in order to add any regulations, whoever is proposing to add regulations needs to also propose to take away at least 2 regulations in its place. So that's kind of an overall framework of what we've been seeing in the new administration in the first 100 days.
Okay, great. So this is Rita again, and I'm going to go over the President's fiscal year 2018 budget blueprint, which you may have heard called the skinny budget. The President is calling it the America First budget. So if you hear those 2 terms, they're the same budget that we're talking about. All right, so there were 3 big priorities that were outlined in the budget blueprint. The first was really returning control of education back to the states and to the local districts, and that was emphasized very clearly in the budget blueprint. The second piece was on simplifying financial aid processes and streamlining, and I think this goes hand in hand with what Monica mentioned in terms of looking at regulations and decreasing bureaucracy and things like that. The third big thing, which also Monica mentioned, was increasing school choice options. And so the budget actually, even though he decreases the overall education budget, there is a huge $1.4 billion increase for school choice programs. So as I said, the budget is decreased by $9 billion in cuts. And I just want to put this into context that the President's budget overall increases defense spending by $54 billion. And so there has to be cuts and reductions in other programs, and that's why it's a 13.5% reduction in the education budget, which actually brings us back down to the same level of funding as 2008. And so this is the lowest amount of funding that we've had in just the last 10 years. So I want to go over now the specific programs that have been proposed for complete elimination. So these are the 3 programs, the 3 biggest programs outlined. The first is the Supporting Effective Instruction State Grant, which is going to be referred to in the news as Title II in ESSA. And this really is the major federal funding stream that schools and districts use to support teachers. It's $2.4 billion. This is the same amount, this is the pot of money that is used to make sure that low-income students and students of color actually have access to high-quality teachers and principals. So it's really important for our communities in particular. This is also the funding that is used for class size reduction. I just wanted to note here that the elimination of these Title II funds is the same as losing 40,000 teachers across the country. And looking very specifically at California, which I know has a large percentage of our students, this would be equivalent, or this proposed cut would have California losing $263 million in funding that would pay for approximately 3,600 teachers in California alone. So I want to go on to the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. These are after-school programs for low-income students that provide academic, artistic, and cultural enrichment programs. So we're talking about $1.2 billion of these after-school programs and summer learning programs that impact 1.6 million students across the country. A lot of the parents, 80% of them, of the parents of students who participate are working parents, and they say that these programs actually help them keep their jobs because they occupy students' time and the parents don't have to provide child care because they're in these programs. The third category of funds proposed for elimination are the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, which is a mouthful. This is $732 million in grants. They range anywhere from $100 to $4,000 a year for students. And these grants are the ones who go to students with exceptional financial need. So only Pell Grant students are the ones who receive this. So this is in addition to their Pell Grants. All right, so we are going to now discuss the programs that are proposed for reductions. The first one is the Federal Work-Study Program, which is reduced significantly. There wasn't a dollar amount attached to it, but basically the president is saying that they want to retarget where the funds go, so they're reaching students with the most financial need, and they're just going to find ways to cut it down. I want to note here that currently federal work studies subsidizes about 700,000 students every year. The second group of programs proposed for reductions are Pell, TRIO, and Gear Up, and these are all targeted towards having low-income, first-in-the-family students, really prepare them for college. And also Pell is geared towards low-income students who just need financial aid. So the reductions here would be $193 million for the TRIO and Gear Up programs, which are noted in the budget blueprint as savings. And then the other big thing is, even though Pell grants are maintained at their current level, there's actually $3.9 billion of unobligated funds, which are basically unpaid funds carried over from prior years. And those are being canceled, which means they are not available to be given out to Pell Grant recipients this year. Or, I'm sorry, in 2018. The other group of programs, there are 20 other programs. The president did not list them all in his budget blueprint, but he gave examples, which include Striving Readers, teacher quality partnerships, impact aid support payments, and then also international education programs. So here we created a chart for you to look at just to see what the biggest budget cuts are, and those are, the first one is the Title II grants for having high quality teachers and principals. Your after school programs are next, then your supplemental education opportunity grants, and then TRIO and Gear Up. Okay, so there are a few programs that are charted for increases, as I mentioned. So it's $1 billion for Title I schools. Title I schools are the ones that are serving our lowest income students. But I want to note that there are strings attached to this $1 billion. It's dedicated to districts that are going to adopt a different form of budgeting, where the funds can follow the student if they choose to go to a different school. So this essentially is a voucher school choice program being promoted in the low-income schools. The second thing is that the president proposed increasing charter school funding by 50%, so $168 million more for charter schools, which are currently funded at $300 million. And then the last thing, which is new, is to create a unspecified private school choice program at $250 million, so that our public money would then be going towards private schools. There were two big programs that were mentioned in the president's budget that were preserved. The first is IDEA, which supports students with disabilities at $13 billion. So the funding was not decreased or increased. It was maintained at the same levels. The Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, came under fire quite a bit for not knowing a lot about IDEA, so we suspect this is why it's maintained at its current level. The second thing is that historically Black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions were also maintained at their current funds at $492 million. And so this would include AAPIs, which serve our community members, as well as Hispanic serving institutions and other MSIs. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Suvan, who's going to talk about other education cuts in different agencies.
Thanks, Rita. So, so my colleague Rita just went over programs just within the U.S. Department of Education. And other federal agencies have programs that are related to education and go a long way in supporting our students' education from pre-K through college. So some of these programs, their logos are shown here. There are Medicaid, school lunch, SNAP, Head Start. The U.S. Department of Education, Trump proposed an overall $4.7 billion cut from their program. And then one specific program he targeted to cut $200 million from was WIC, or also known as Women, Infant, and Children program. A few things we also looked at were the SNAP program, so that's like your food stamps, and free and reduced price school lunch program. Those SNAP and free reduced price lunch, they were not targeted in the budget cuts. And then in the Department of Health and Human Services, so we looked at Medicaid and Head Start. These are programs within this agency, and they had an overall department budget cut of $12.6 billion. But the specific programs of Head Start and Medicaid, thankfully, were not targeted. And so we looked at Medicaid because, some of the funding from Medicaid actually goes towards providing support for children that are eligible for special education services, who have specific healthcare needs that may affect their educational performance. And so part of this process is that we've been talking about the president's proposed budget. So this is kind of how the process goes, where the president proposes a budget, and it's important to look at it, even though he may not be able to, he doesn't actually pass any bills. Congress's job is to actually fund each of these federal agencies. But once Congress passes their own budget, the president has to sign the budget into law, right? And then that's how the agencies are funded. So it's a system of our American government of checks and balances. So one example was Congress recently reached a budget deal, and even though the president's proposed budget did not target Head Start at all, Congress actually increased funding for the Head Start program by $85 million. And I'm just going to pass it over to my colleague Kim to talk about some of the rhetoric that we've been hearing from this administration.
Hi, everyone. So as Suvan mentioned, I'm going to be giving a brief overview of the rhetoric that we've seen this election cycle and the administration, and kind of how it has changed the education stratosphere thus far. So it's no secret that the first 100 days and the presidential campaign, kind of more broadly, has been plagued by harmful nationalist, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and xenophobic attitudes towards our community and many marginalized communities. But this painting of marginalized communities with a broad brushstroke has kind of had a lot of effects on the actions of the administration, especially in terms of civil rights and education, because of how this rhetoric portrayed our communities. So 4 big items of discussion are the appointment of Betsy DeVos to the Secretary of Education position, and then, of course, Candace Jackson as the acting Assistant Secretary of Civil Rights. And this has kind of triggered conversation about the direction of the Office of Civil Rights in the future. And then the sanctuary campus movement kind of on a more state and local level. And then, of course, Title IX coverage specifically for transgender students. So one of the biggest concerns of the civil rights community is ensuring that the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education can continue to uphold its core mission. So the Office for Civil Rights' mission is to ensure equal access to education, and its primary role is enforcing the laws that protect marginalized populations. So this includes students of color, religious minorities, students regardless of gender or sexual orientation or perceived gender or sexual orientation, and then students with disabilities. And they fulfill this mission by following up on specific cases of discrimination, tracking data on how well public schools can create equitable learning opportunities, and issuing guidance to local and state school districts to clarify their legal obligation to protect these communities. Some examples of guidance or regulations that OCR can release is the guidance that clarifies the right of transgender students to use facilities provided by public schools. Another is clarifying the juvenile justice residential facilities must provide equal opportunities to access academic coursework and career and technical education. But it's important to note that this guidance doesn't necessarily change the law, but it clarifies the extent that OCR or the Office for Civil Rights will protect the rights of a particular community. So how has the rhetoric in this first 100 days changed the Office for Civil Rights? Well, immediately following the election, organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center came out talking about their research that the most common sites for post-election harassment incidents are schools. But despite this spike in reported incidents, there's been a lot of concern about the direction of OCR and whether it will change or be less effective under our new secretary. So what do I mean? So what exactly is next? So there have been talks of at least downsizing OCR as a way to diminish the federal footprint in education. And ultimately, even though the core mission and goals of OCR will not change, cutting the budget or downsizing OCR may allow more state and local discrimination incidents to go unchecked and could hinder its ability in actually carrying out their mission. And an event that could also impact the future of OCR in the Department of Education is kind of the appointment of Betsy DeVos to the Secretary of Education post. Her contentious appointment process really sparked conversation about school privatization and the separation of church and state because of her longtime commitment to school choice programs. For example, in Michigan, what she's really known for is her long history in working to create voucher programs, which ultimately diverts kind of public money to private and religious institutions. And at this moment, her main goal or platform is to bring that up to the federal level. And her appointment has become a civil rights issue because school privatization agenda ultimately undermines our precious public education system because of it siphons much needed money for the most at-risk students and funnels it into private schools that often have little civil rights accountability. And then more recently was the relatively quiet appointment of Candace Jackson, who was tapped to serve as the acting Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights. So she's a little problematic because her past writings when she was a student at Stanford made claims that equal opportunity or affirmative action policies discriminate against white students. So she seems to be kind of ignorant of the history and effects of race and sex discrimination in education and how it is still present today. But by appointing Jackson, who has also had limited experience in education overall, kind of raises questions about the direction of OCR and how civil rights protections are going to be enforced. Zooming out a little bit, another movement that has been happening at the state and local level in response to this administration is the sanctuary campus movement. Basically, the sanctuary campus movement is calling on institutions of higher education to declare themselves a safe space for undocumented students, which means these universities will refuse to aid federal officials in the event of a raid. And there's a lot of debate going on the purpose of the sanctuary campus movement. On one hand, people are concerned because there's really no legal standing to a sanctuary campus title. So despite the title, ICE is still technically allowed to be on the campus because of its the public space that is created. But on the other hand, many school leaders see the sanctuary campus movement as a very important and symbolic way to stand up to the federal government and protect undocumented students, their privacy, and their right to a good education. And lastly, a big topic for conversation in the first 100 days is the Title IX protections for transgender students. So Title IX at the most basic level is the federal law that makes it illegal for schools that receive federal funding to discriminate based on sex and perceived sex. On February 21st, barely 1 month into the new administration, the Trump administration withdrew this critical guidance that summarized best practices from school districts that highlighted that under Title IX, transgender students are to be treated according to their gender identity. And it's important to note that withdrawing this guidance did not reverse the law itself. So transgender students are still to be treated according to their gender identity, but it did take away practical information for schools to implement good policies and also make it harder for students and parents to know their legal rights. So just in conclusion, the rhetoric used throughout election season and the first 100 days to isolate and further marginalize minority communities are animated by these changes taking place in education. And it's really important for the AAPI community and other marginalized communities as well to be aware of how this rhetoric will further fuel changes in policy.
Thanks, Kim. Before we jump into resources here, we just want to give a few minutes for folks to see if they have any questions. And just as another note, as we share, for folks that joined us a little bit later, in your control panel for the webinar, there's a drop-down option to chat with us. There is where you could communicate with us any questions that you may have. Right? If your control panel is minimized, click on the orange button to show the control panel. And then it should pop up questions, and then you can chat with us. All right, we'll give folks a few minutes.
well, it sounds like there aren't any questions right now from the audience. Moving forward, we would love to hear more from you if you think of a question via email or anything. But for more resources, we just wanted to share previous webinars that we have had so that you can relook at them, as well as some Department of Education websites that have been really helpful around the work that we've been doing. And we know that this webinar was really an overview of what's been going on in the past 100 days. So if there are topics that you would like us to have a future activity around that digs deeper, then we're definitely open to that as well. Please make sure to contact us. This is our email addresses. I'm sorry, it's a little bit difficult to see, but they are there. You know, I think in conclusion, we really wanted to just emphasize how, you know, there have been a lot of executive actions. Some have been specific to education and some have been more general, but definitely impact our students and our educators and our community members, either directly or indirectly, and could have the potential to have a very big negative impact against our communities. However, you know, some of these executive actions that need congressional approval are being challenged by the House and the Senate right now. For example, with the budget, all of the proposed cuts that Rita went over didn't necessarily go through because at the end of the day, our Congress holds the purse to our country's spending. And then some of the proposals that don't need congressional approval are also being challenged by the courts across the country, and hopefully will be moving up from the local to the districts to our highest court as well. And if anything, I think right now in terms of the first 100 days, it really shows the importance of our separation of powers and the checks and balances that are assured within our Constitution. And so we have several more days to go, but you know, we will be here, and we are definitely excited to continue to engage with you.
Right, and if you're asking, you know, what can I do next, you know, having learned about the proposed budget, about the rhetoric, then what we would advise is to pick up the phone and call your congressman, right? If you are absolutely concerned about any of the proposed cuts in the budget, you know, make sure that you let them know, because Congress is the one that, as Monica said, holds the purse strings. If you're concerned about the rhetoric that is being, you know, just that is coming out of the administration, then let your representatives and your senators know. We can always advocate on these things that we find important, and we should not be afraid to speak up. All right. And so I'm going to thank you once again for joining NCAPA's Education Committee on this webinar, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.